Yo guys, so I wanted to talk real quick about the recent game between G2 and BDS and a little bit about how G2 can come up with such a unique and interesting drafting methodology in a time where so many teams are, I guess, not really creative at this point. The meta for the first early patches of Season 14 has been, let's quote unquote, relatively solved in terms of what teams like to pick. But teams like G2 have a totally different sort of value basis on what determines a good draft for them. And I think they really showcase this in their absolute clinic that they delivered to BDS to basically annihilate them in playoffs here. So this starts in game one with the Twisted Fate top. Now, to preface, we obviously, as viewers, don't know everything that justifies their decisions in certain slots and what they think because there's information asymmetry. So things like scrim information, specific weaknesses that they're tailoring for that they may or may not be tailoring for, to be honest with you, and just drafting for certain playstyles. These are all aspects of draft that aren't necessarily covered from someone like us who's trying to review the way they draft from an outside perspective. So with that being said, the reason for things like the Twisted Fate top is G2's basis for evaluating draft and their needs of their draft is based on what the comp needs, what their team needs as players, and what can be described as the best tools to answer what they want to do within the constraints of the meta, of course, right? Meta is effectively just a social construct in the sense that it is just an idea of what is generally regarded as good. It doesn't mean that you have to agree to it, right? Meta is technically subjective, even though it is the most common picks. And as long as you're meeting the needs of what your team needs to do, that's the idea of it being able to be adapted, right? So jumping to this TF top, G2 end up picking it on 2-3 here with the idea that they are basically just blinding it, right? This is something new, this has been recently buffed, and it's something for BDS to basically chew on 2-3. What they don't realize though is once they reveal that their comp is basically BDS doesn't see the hole in their comp, let's put it that way. And this is because G2 end up identifying a potential idea of, okay, so BDS has to slot a damaged top laner, and with the current available options in the meta, there's going to be not too many options at this point, right? And there's going to be things like the Rumble that was eventually picked, just potentially things like the Jace, or like, there's not going to be a melee champion topside. So that's why they actually opt into putting the Azir into mid instead, because effectively this R5 is kind of fake from BDS, right? Sure, it's TF top, but it's very weird and it's non-conventional, but with the buffs and the knowledge that BDS have to pick something like the Rumble in the top side, it actually negates some of the biggest strengths of that champion, and it makes it really weird for a team like BDS because it's non-conventional and they get punished in a lane where they normally wouldn't be able to be thinking about that, because they're thinking in the lens of what's normally meta. But G2 are more creative, they access more options, and this forces a situation where something like the TF top can actually be gotten away with. So that's why things like this are possible. This example carries forward when you move to game 2, but to a lesser extent, right? So this is a similar case where it seems that clearly BDS cannot really thrive nearly as well without something like Adam being in a high pressure scenario on top side. So I would kind of call this more of a fumble from BDS here because of the Blitzcrank on B3 being a little bit of a ambitious pick. This is the attempt here. It makes sense because it's sort of a pre-pick into the quote-unquote Kalista Renata. So that was trying to justify the methodology here. However, where I don't agree with this is the idea of the Blitzcrank itself, because it is a very flawed champion, and picking it as early as B3 gives you a lot of options to play around it, as you can see with the Kalista Braum. We haven't been seeing too much Braum in this meta, but there's always going to be situations like this where champions situationally will exceed the value of any sort of meta, right? Meta is more just like there as a guideline in order to give you decent picks, help you identify what can be good, what's great openers, and there's genuinely really strong picks sometimes, like the Varus here, right? But obviously with things like matchups and compositional counters and things of this nature, these are things that cannot be ignored because honestly, as a byproduct of meta, some champions will come up simply because they counter other champions and whether or not they address the needs of the meta. So that's why, in this case, the Braum is excellent. What helps further emphasize this is that G2 locked the Lilia on 4 in order to prevent Team BDS from actually going forward at all. And basically, if you're BDS, this will give an opportunity to try to play for space instead and maybe potentially out damage them with front to back. Just getting winning matchups and creating space that way. However, this is when G2 again tap into their heavy flexes and go for the Yasuo on R5. So although it's very non-conventional and it's overall a backwards comp, I think the way that G2 is playing their Yasuo here is most likely through sideline and absolutely dominating this Gnar and preventing this BDS comp from being able to function. That's the idea behind this. This is something that most teams will not really cash in on, but it's actually an excellent matchup into the Gnar, but no one's going to really notice that. And it creates a kind of a catch-22 for BDS because now they cannot play towards their win con. So it's applying a lot of pressure through options that are non-conventional. And the last game, I would say, is the least creative out of all 3 G2 drafts because they ended up being blue side this time, so they don't have the opportunity to counterpick. But again, they tap into some more unique picks that can give them more interesting options against teams that aren't willing to go and tap into them. So in this case, I would say it's the Ivern, although I would say it's less of like an off-meta thing, but more of just something that's probably decently good, all things considered. But this is more of like a tech pick into the brand, matching scaling. You have Hui, that's also a decent counter into the Azir because it's almost like a Xerath mindset. And the list goes on, right? So that's the whole idea behind this, right? G2 don't see it as, oh, these champions are best in slot. We have to pick this champ here because that's good. And that's a really creative thing that even someone like myself could struggle with sometimes, because seeing a champion just get picked by every team, of course you're going to want to think, oh, I'm going to have to pick this too. Or seeing Twisted Fate top, like you would think it's completely absurd, right? But everything will always have its own place within certain situations. It's always contextual. It's self-balancing in that sense. And I think that's kind of the takeaway here for all of us, right? G2 are clearly a team that is extremely creative, almost to a fault sometimes with what they pick, but it's very, very nice that they are able to push the envelope here. And I just wanted to point that out. So hopefully this would make sense to you guys, and I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.